on the main highways outside the city. Travelling between different regions has also been restricted. BBC News.
Hello again, friends, and welcome to Madison BookBeat, your listener-sponsored community radio home for Madison authors, Madison topics, Madison book events, and Madison publishers. I'm your host, Stu Levitan. Our guest today is Madison's own John Nichols. His new book, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, the enduring legacy of Henry Wallace's anti-fascist, anti-racist politics, is from the fine folks at Verso Press. As to Henry Wallace, he was, during the 30s and 40s, the highest-ranking leader in American politics who was both resolutely anti-fascist and anti-racist. For a time in the late 30s and early 40s, he was also, after Franklin Roosevelt himself, the most important American politician. 2 terms as the New Deal Secretary of Agriculture, the war years as the most powerful vice president in modern history up to that point. Even after losing the vice presidential nomination to Harry Truman in 1944, he remained powerful as Secretary of Commerce. But then FDR died 6 weeks into his 4th term, and Wallace was not enough of a Cold War imperialist for the new president, who fired him in the fall of 1946, which set the stage for an ill-advised and ill-fated campaign as the Progressive Party candidate for president in 1948. And then a long, slow slide into an outcast's obscurity. What his career meant at the time, has meant since, and could mean for the Democratic Party in the future, has occupied John Nichols for some time and is the focus of his new book. As to John Nichols, you probably know he is a Wisconsin native, associated editor of the Capital Times, national affairs correspondent for The Nation, contributing writer to The Progressive and In These Times. And in his spare time, he writes books. In addition to this latest one about Henry Wallace, he is the author of Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse, a field guide to the most dangerous people in America, Jews for Buchanan, The Genius of Impeachment, and a best-selling biography of the former Vice President Dick, the Man Who Was President, which was also published in French and Arabic. He edited Against the Beast, a documentary history of American opposition to empire, and with Bob McChesney has co-authored a half-dozen books about the failings of media and politics, most recently, People Get Ready, the fight against a jobless economy and a citizenless democracy. Brothers and sisters, it is a pleasure to welcome to Madison BookBeat my friend, John Nichols.
Well, Stuart, that's probably the best intro I've ever had.
Well, I appreciate it, John. I like to show credit where it is due, and thanks for being with us today. How far to the front does Henry Wallace stand in your personal pantheon of political heroes?
Pretty far. He stands nearer the front than most. But it's interesting that we should underline that word political, because he was not a brilliant politician. And you and I have talked a lot about politics over the years, and we've identified people that we think of as master politicians. Frankly, I think Franklin Roosevelt was a master politician, incredibly skilled. That wasn't Wallace. Wallace was more of a moralist. He was more of a true believer, somebody who saw what was wrong, what was flawed in society, in the world, and tried to right it. And so in many cases, he was an outlier from our politics. And yet, for a brief period, mainly because of the patronage of Roosevelt, he was put at the center of it. And when he stood there, it is safe to say that very few figures with so much power fought so hard for economic and social and racial justice. So he really is a man ahead of his time in many ways.
Is it the things he stood for or what he actually got accomplished that puts him so far in the front?
That's a good question, Stuart, and the answer is both. As Secretary of Agriculture, there is simply no question that along with Francis Perkins over at the Department of Labor, he was the consummate New Dealer. He was someone who got the point of the New Deal, which is you looked at a problem and you figured out how to address it. And if it didn't work the first time, you tried a second time and a third time and a fourth, but you did big, bold things. And that Department of Agriculture, when I was doing the research on Wallace, I read through all the documents and all the background there. I don't think people today can begin to understand how important the Department of Agriculture was in the 1930s. It was a driving force, not just on farm issues, but on a host of economic and social issues throughout society. And Wallace brought an incredible group of people into his ferment. And long after he was gone, people like John Kenneth Galbraith and others, said, this was the guy who really made the New Deal run. He got that engine going in so many ways. So there he was incredible. Also, as vice president, it's very important to know that when he came in as vice president, Roosevelt wanted to move the New Deal to the left. He wanted to make it a more progressive reality. But he also was a team of rivals president, right? And so he had people who were quite conservative in his administration. And there was a great wrangling there. And there's simply no doubt that in that period, before World War II and into World War II, it was Wallace who kept the New Deal flag flying and who promoted the idea that when the war was done, they had to keep doing big things. That was really, really important. And then also, finally, there's simply no question that along with Eleanor Roosevelt, it was Wallace who pressured Franklin Roosevelt and pressured, frankly, the whole of the country to think far more seriously about issues of race. And that's a big deal.
As to the Department of Agriculture, as you know, Henry A. Wallace's father, Henry C. Wallace, was also Secretary of Agriculture, appointed by Warren Harding.
Yep.
And he actually died in office in 1924, long before, of course, Henry A. got into office. Presumably, Henry C. would not have supported the New Deal, being a Harding appointee.
You know what? Can I interrupt you just for a sec?
Well, yeah.
I think there's a possibility he would have, because the Wallaces were such outliers. They were progressive Republicans, and they were so committed to the condition of farmers that I'm not sure that Henry A. Wallace's father wouldn't have gone with him toward the New Deal because of their deep concern about the impoverishment of farmers during the Depression. So just my footnote there, but only a footnote.
Well, no, that's not a footnote. That's answering the question. Well, the other question is, this is a unique situation, being the Secretary of a department that your father was Secretary of. Yeah. Did Henry A. ever write about this or talk about this, that particular relationship with his father?
Yes, he did. And the important thing to understand is that they both edited a publication in the great era of publications. You and I come from Madison, so we know the Progressive, right? And we know the Progressive magazine as an institution rooted in a place that speaks to the country. There was a publication that the Wallaces ran called Wallace's Farmer that was rooted in a place, Des Moines, Iowa, that spoke to the country and particularly spoke to farmers, but to a lot of people beyond farm communities. And so, yes, Wallace was very conscious of the dynamic of carrying on from his father, just as he carried on with the Wallace's Farmer newspaper as the editor there. I think he felt in many ways he was carrying on from his father in this sort of deep concern for working farmers, but also something else, that there was a sense on the part of the Wallaces that the condition of farmers, particularly what we would today refer to as family farmers, was had a unique politics onto it, and that there needed to be a lot of defense of their interests and championship of it in a country that was becoming increasingly urban and industrialized. And so, yeah, he did write about it. He revered his father. He had great respect for his dad. And frankly, it's important to understand that had it not been for his father, he would not have been so prominent a figure in agricultural communities. And it is less likely that that Roosevelt would have gone hunting for Henry Wallace. And it's important to understand that it was Roosevelt who reached out to Henry Wallace in 1932 and said, yeah, you're the son of a former Secretary of Agriculture, you're the editor of this great publication, but I think you, as a longtime progressive Republican, ought to be with me in favor of a New Deal.
Very interesting. Henry Wallace made his mark in Des Moines, but was actually born in Rock Island, where my grandfather was the Orthodox rabbi a couple of decades later. So I have a one-step removed relationship with Henry Wallace.
I see you as very close.
I mentioned in the introduction that you've been thinking some time about Henry Wallace and the past and the present and the future. How long has the election of 1944 stuck in your craw as a turning point, both for the Democratic Party and the country?
Pretty long time. When I was a little boy growing up in Union Grove, Wisconsin, my dad was in the Air Force Reserves, and he was in the Staff Judge Advocates Corps. So every year we would go down to Kansas City, Missouri, to Richards Gabor Air Force Base, because he was stationed down there in the summer, just for a brief, as you do in the reserves, a brief time where you're kind of on active duty, and so I grew up knowing a lot about Harry Truman and reading a lot about elections. And when I was a very young kid, I got a book on the 1948 election, and I read through it, and it was a well done book. And I believe it was called The Last Campaign. And what it did, what was so fascinating, or The Loneliest Campaign, I think. What was so fascinating about it was that it did have long sections on Wallace. And I was so interested in him because of this unique dynamic, a former vice president running against a former vice president. In fact, the guy who replaced him. Now, that's not unheard of in American politics. Remember, think of Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey, both former vice presidents, but not people from the same party. And so I was always interested in that question of why Wallace didn't get the gig, why it didn't remain with Henry Wallace. And so I've been thinking about it for quite a long time. But I have to be honest with you, Stuart, what really inspired me to start thinking about it in a deeper way was the election of Donald Trump. Because Wallace had written an essay in 1943 on the dangers of American fascism, in which he wrote about authoritarianism and about the Wall Street seeking to coalesce with those who would divide the country along lines of race and gender and things of that nature. And it just struck me after Trump became president that it was time to really revisit that question of what Wallace had sought to do, and frankly why he was not successful in ultimately doing it.
Actually, you've jumped a couple of steps ahead. I'll go there, and then I'll double back. It's July 1943. Henry Wallace goes to Detroit and makes a speech attacking what he calls Americanized fascism, and he uses those words, Americanized. Yes. And this isn't a one-off speech. He keeps writing about it. He keeps talking about this very, with vigor and emphasis. Who was he talking about, and what was it that they were doing that was fascist?
Yeah. So this is you go to the heart of it, and really that was sort of for me the starting point for this book, because when you write a book that has a lot of history in it, you also want to address the current moment as best you can, and it was interesting that after Trump became president, Wallace's essay, "The Danger of American Fascism," circulated. People were like, "Whoa, somebody said that 75 years ago? This is really interesting." And so what happened in 1943 was, frankly, a undertold part of our American history. And that was that Philip Randolph in 1940, 1941 had threatened to have the first march on Washington for civil rights. And Roosevelt was so, frankly, troubled by that he invited Randolph to the White House. They negotiated. And ultimately, Roosevelt integrated what became the war industries, the defense contractors. That integration worked in many places, but there was also tension. And you frankly saw in a number of cities around this country race riots. And they were violent, they were deadly. Often the police were on the side of white folks who were trying to intimidate or scare black folks. And in Detroit, they had one of the worst race riots of the period, 1943, in July, as you say. Around more than 40 people were killed. I believe 17 killed by the police, all of them African American. There were some white folks, I think, who died in those riots as well, but it was primarily African Americans who were killed. And Wallace flew to Detroit and said, I want to speak to a integrated rally, and I want to talk about what's going on. The unions, which were very supportive of Wallace, put together a rally, and Wallace got up and he said, you know, the title of the speech, I believe, was America Tomorrow. He was talking about the future. And he said, this is something we have to understand. We're going to win this war, but what people need to understand is what we're fighting against in Europe. We are fighting against people that identify a class of human beings as inferior and that practices violence against them. And there are people in America who do that, and they are practicing Americanized fascism. And he identified racism and you know, lynchings, attacks on people, the whole bit, as an Americanized fascism.
And what was the reaction to the speech and the writings that he continued afterwards?
Not good. The truth of the matter is, while African Americans who were fighting, and remember, the important thing to understand is that A. Philip Randolph and African American newspapers in this country were at that time waging what was called the Double V campaign, 2 victories: victory against fascism, victory against racism. And so this was broader than just Henry Wallace, but here you had the Vice President of the United States talking about it. And so those folks were very sympathetic to what Wallace had said. Many of the CIO unions were very sympathetic to what Wallace had said. But the New York Times savaged him in their editorial page and said he was dividing the war effort. He was saying things that shouldn't be said. They challenged him to identify, quote unquote, these American fascists. And Wallace turned around and wrote an essay for him. And he said, he was very specific. He said, there are, of course, the people who dress up like Nazis, right? Who really are, you know, like an Americanized version of what you might see in Europe. But he said there are also a lot of other folks who are something very different. They don't dress in some, you know, like brown shirt or something like that. They may wear a suit and tie. They may be very distinguished in their language. They may sit on Wall Street, or they may even sit in the U.S. Senate. And yet they promote a racist ideology and a racist approach, segregation, and all the violence that extended from it. And he said they use that to divide working class people against one another. And they frankly use that to prevent America to move forward. And so he was very, very blunt about it. And when he wrote that piece in the Times, it was a unique thing. It appeared in the New York Times magazine in spring of 1944. And fascinatingly enough, on the same day it appeared, the New York Times had an editorial attacking him for saying what he said in their own magazine. So,
as a demagogue.
Yes, exactly right. So Wallace did not have an easy ride in making this argument, and it was one that was at the heart of the great struggle of that period over what would come after World War II. And Stuart, this is one of the most fascinating things in writing the book. You know, you do, as you do when you write your books, you do an immense amount of research, and you go back and you learn so much more than when you started. And one of the things that I can say with great confidence is that the notion of the United States as a very united country during World War II is a false notion. The United States had a unity of purpose in fighting against European fascism, but there were still deep divisions here at home. And those divisions really expressed themselves in a debate about what to do after World War II. And what 2 prominent figures, I'd say 3 prominent figures. I think Eleanor Roosevelt can fairly be included in this as well. But certainly what 2 prominent political figures who were involved in electoral politics said was that as we came out of World War II, we needed to address racism. It had to be an immediate issue, and we had to address it because if we were going to speak to the rest of the world about a vision for the future that was better than other countries, we had to clean up our own house. We had to make things right at home. And the 2 people who said that were Henry Wallace and Wendell Willkie. And the fascinating thing was Willkie a Republican, Wallace a Democrat, both younger political figures. And if you read their writings from that period, Willkie's One World, Wallace's many essays and arguments, they were stunningly parallel in their understanding that race needed to be addressed. When you combine into that the work of A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and other civil rights activists of that period, what you understand was there was a side if you will, in this great debate. There was a group of people who were saying, when as World War II finishes, as we win this war, we have to bring our energy home and address racism here. And there was another side that said, no, you're moving too fast. That's too much. Or frankly, going so far as to say, no, we don't want to do that.
We're talking with John Nichols. His latest book is The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, The Enduring Legacy of Henry Wallace's Anti-Fascist, Anti-Racist Politics. It's from the good people at Verso Press. This is going on 1943, 1944. It's middle of the war and started. The tide has turned a little bit. How powerful a vice president is Henry Wallace at this point?
Well, he was very powerful in the first years of Roosevelt's third term. And Wallace was a consummate scholar and a consummate student. And so he literally read everything on the vice presidency and wrote memos on how to recreate the office, which Roosevelt loved. Roosevelt thought it was very much embraced what Wallace was proposing, gave Wallace an immense power over the war effort, and particularly over getting the raw materials for the war effort. In some ways, that actually extended from his old work at the Department of Agriculture, which was very systems-oriented, how you produce things, how do you get things where they need to be. And so Wallace had a lot of power, but he did things with that power that made him very controversial within the White House. And so, for instance, he said that workers in defense industries and in production industries, both in the U.S. and frankly outside the U.S. who were producing goods that the U.S. needed, like rubber workers and, folks who worked in South America and other places, needed to be paid a living wage. That was incredibly controversial with the bankers and the more corporate types within the administration. And frankly, great battles broke out. Ultimately, Wallace was somewhat disempowered. And in his last year of his vice presidency, he had less power than he did in his first 3 years. And there's simply no question of that. But what's fascinating is what he did in that situation where he was somewhat marginalized as regards a hyper-powerful figure within the White House is he grabbed the bully pulpit. And so he traveled the country and talked about race, social change, economic justice. Fascinating thing is that as Vice President of the United States, and Roosevelt also loved this, even though there would be pushes and pulls, Wallace would go out and meet with Jewish leaders who said, we have to recognize the Holocaust and do more to address it. He would meet with African-American leaders who said, we have to address race and do more to address racism in this country. With Latinos in the Southwest, with women, he was an ardent advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment. And so the fascinating thing was he was traveling around the country, bringing this information back to Roosevelt, and at the same time, championing the war effort and the New Deal. And so even as he was a little less powerful in the last stages of his vice presidency, he was more popular. The polls showed, it was a Gallup poll done in the spring of 1944, showed that he was not just the popular choice for vice president, he was the overwhelming choice. And not just among Democrats, but the people across the political spectrum really respected this guy.
I want to get to why he wasn't chosen in 1944, but just to step back once to another speech he gave in 1942. As a writer and an editor, we can expect he'd give good speeches, but he gave a speech in May of 1942 to the Free World Association saying, this is not the American century as proposed by Henry Luce, this is the century of the common man. How big a deal was the speech, the price of free world victory?
You cannot begin to, Stuart, we could do a whole show on that. And I'm so glad you focused on it for a moment. Henry Wallace, the way to understand him is he's not somebody who just gave a speech because I've got a speech scheduled tonight. When he gave a speech, he would research, for weeks before he went into it. He intended his speeches to be transformative moments, that they would make people think in new ways. And so earlier in that period, Henry Luce had written an argument that was oddly very parallel to a lot of what Wallace said. It was this: World War II is going to be a transformative moment. The U.S. needs to be on the side of those fighting fascism. But Luce's argument was that we should do all this, obviously for whatever good comes of it, but also because that what comes forward should be an American century. And the U.S. should essentially be this very dominant force in the world. It should guide the rest of the world and tell the rest of the world what to do. And Wallace objected to that. He said, no, that's not, we should, Wallace was very influenced by, frankly, by his religion, which ran very, very deep. He believed very strongly that you lead by example. He didn't think you force people unless, you're fighting against fascism itself. Rather, he thought you influence people by showing them, how to do things right, to create that city on a hill, if you will. And so he said, instead of an American century, it ought to be a century of the common man. And that ought to be true, and frankly, he would add common woman, across the planet, that we should work to raise the circumstance of people in the United States, but frankly, we should work to raise the circumstance of people around the world. And he explicitly criticized imperialism, colonialism, and said a lot of things about how the world had to change after World War II. Now, that put him very much at odds with Henry Luce, obviously at odds with a number of other folks.
Winston Churchill, for one.
Churchill hated it because of the colonialism part. And Churchill really hated Henry Wallace. But the fascinating thing is just think about some of what came out of that speech. Aaron Copland's music. Aaron Copland wrote music based off this. People wrote poetry based off it. Movements were built off it. What Wallace did with that speech was so incredibly powerful. It was literally they videotaped him. He gave a speech to an event, but then he was videotaped reading it. And that was one of the most watched in that. And I may be using the wrong terminology here with videotape. They filmed it. That's one of the most watched political films of that time. He delivered it not just in English, but then also did it in Spanish. He was a multilingual political figure. He learned new languages for fun. And he spoke Spanish quite well. And he did it in Spanish. And it was played all over Latin America. And it was considered to be very, very influential at a time when the Germans were trying to get a foothold in Latin America to providing an alternative vision there. Again, as I said, we could go on for a whole show about how influential that speech was. But I will tell you that even today, when you listen to Aaron Copland, as it's played on public radio and places like that, you will hear echoes of that speech from almost 80 years ago.
Not only played on public radio, but Bob Dylan used it as the entrance music for several tours on the Never-Ending Tour. You'd go to the hall, and there would be fanfare for the common man.
You can't. And I have to tell you, Stuart, this is one of the, again, we talk about, because we're talking about doing books, right? This is one of the great joys of doing this book, because as I said, Wallace tried to make things happen. When he gave a speech, he wanted it to have resonance. And you just saw the incredible resonance of this speech. And reading what people wrote about it, what people thought about it, I don't even know if, I guess Obama gave a few speeches that resonated so powerfully that we all talked about it, at least for a time. But it's very, very rare in history that you have someone who, in Wallace's case, on a pretty regular basis, did this.
So we get to 1944 and the Democratic Convention in Chicago, and Franklin Roosevelt, who must know he's dying, still hasn't said who he wants as vice president. I have never been able to understand that. Was this just a psychological avoidance of the fact that you don't want, or why was he playing games with the most important decision that convention could make?
Because earlier in the show, we mentioned that Franklin Roosevelt was a consummate politician. In 1944, in the summer of 1944, one of the things I did in the book was I read all kinds of military histories of the period, because I was interested in really where the war effort was. And just imagine that summer of 1944. You'd had D-Day, but less known to Americans is what the Russians were doing. I mean, they were really moving in major ways against the Nazis on the Eastern Front. And so you had things were really starting to close in on the Nazis. And the war had clearly shifted. Also in Asia, the war against the Japanese had clearly shifted, with the Americans particularly really scoring a lot of victories. And not all, there were setbacks, but there was something real happening there. And then you also had in that period the Warsaw Ghetto Rising and other risings that were showing a resistance that was there really was a fight, and it was clear that there's something of a race against time in many ways, but there was also a sense that the anti-fascists would prevail, and that meant the war was going to end. Roosevelt knew full well that his first responsibility was to see that war to completion, right? And he was very conscious of that. He was also conscious that what came after the war was going to be a big deal. So he wanted to maintain his presidency, and his party was very divided after World War II. Henry Wallace was on one side. There were Southern segregationists and bankers and big city bosses on another side. Many of them did not want to re-up the New Deal. And so Roosevelt knew that. And there's simply no question. He stood back. He said, I'm going to let you guys sort it out. And he sent very mixed signals. I read every diary and history of this period, many conflicting accounts. I can promise you, this is history that's up for debate. People are fighting over this to this day. But there develops a certain element of clarity here. Roosevelt said, and typed out, had typed out a statement which he said, if Henry Wallace is a friend of mine, if I was a delegate to the convention, I would vote for him. And that was Roosevelt's statement. And the Wallace people had signs that said that. But he also said, but I'm going to let you folks figure this one out. And in other conversations, and Roosevelt did this quite often, he'd say one thing with one group of people, a little something different with others. He said, well, if it's not Wallace, I'm open to William O. Douglas or Harry Truman. And he kept getting badgered on Harry Truman by the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, who was a Missourian. And there's immense debate about whether he said Truman's name first or William O. Douglas's first, who was Supreme Court Justice. And the likelihood is that he actually said Douglas first, but then the guy who was chairman of the DNC flipped it to put Truman first. So all these intrigues, incredible intrigues. But the bottom line is that Roosevelt left it to the convention. I think he had come to a point, I think it's fair to say he'd come to a point where he thought that Wallace might well keep the gig. And there is good evidence that Roosevelt was somewhat unsettled when it wasn't Wallace, because he immediately offered Wallace a place in his cabinet, a very rare thing. But I will emphasize that it was a battle royale like nothing you've ever seen.
But if he really wanted Wallace, sending him on a tour of Siberia and China in the month before the convention was really not a good strategy. I mean,
it wasn't quite a month. It was a few months. It was a little bit longer. Yeah. But you're right. And Wallace didn't handle all that well. And Wallace had been look, Wallace was not a politician. He just wasn't. He wasn't a good politician. But the fascinating thing about the convention is that the bosses were so determined to keep Wallace sidelined. Roosevelt didn't even come to the convention. He was out in California. And they were desperate to keep Wallace sidelined. So they weren't going to let him, this is sitting vice president of the United States, they weren't going to let him speak to the convention. And they finally said, with Roosevelt's acceptance, oh, you can second Franklin Roosevelt's nomination. So imagine that. If maybe that's what will happen to Pence this time, but it's pretty rare that the sitting vice president is given, a seconding speech on an off night. But the weird thing is, the story of that is so incredible because Henry Wallace arrived in Chicago by train, carried his own bag off the tracks, went to dinner with a friend, and the friend said, well, what are you doing to secure the night? Shouldn't you be making calls and doing everything tonight? And he says, I'm going to give a speech tomorrow, and I'll rest my hopes on that. And the speech he gave was one of the most incredible speeches ever given to a convention of either party. Instead of backing off or pulling his punches, he said, the only way we go forward is as a liberal party that embraces racial justice. And he spoke about getting rid of the poll tax. He spoke about, ending segregation and really what at that time was a very progressive vision. And the incredible thing was the speech inspired huge response. People at the convention, I think there was a sense that they were fighting over the future. And there was an incredible response to Wallace's speech, so much so that people who were supporters, like Claude Pepper, the former senator from Florida, thought that if they could just get the convention to vote that night, Wallace would have been renominated. But as I write a whole chapter in the book, they did everything to stop that vote.
Well, take July 20, 1944, Chicago Stadium, a little before 11 o'clock at night. Take us to that precise moment when the Democrats began to abandon the New Deal.
That's exactly right, and that's the heart of the matter. So they're on the floor, and Wallace had given his speech; it had done very well. They're renominating Roosevelt, right? And in the midst of the celebration, in those conventions, they would have 20, 30, 40, 50-minute demonstrations. You can't even imagine the amount of the length of time. Sometimes for hours, they would demonstrate to cheer on their candidate. And in the midst of the demonstration celebrating Roosevelt's renomination, suddenly a Wallace rally or demonstration started breaking out. And the convention really started to wildly chant for a renomination of Henry Wallace. Say, let's just do it. Let's do it tonight. Instead of delaying the vice presidential vote, till tomorrow or something like that, let's renominate the ticket tonight. And Claude Pepper, who was a senator at the time, down in the midst of the Florida delegation, he's a small man. They standing on, like a chair or something. He's looking around and he says, we can do this. We can renominate Wallace tonight. So he starts fighting his way toward the podium of the convention. And it's a huge crowd, and it's a rough, battle. But this is the politics of the time. He got to the steps at the bottom of the podium, and there were railroad workers there, and the unions were very sympathetic to Wallace, and so they knew what Pepper was trying to do. They opened the gate, which they weren't supposed to do, and they let him start, fighting his way up the steps. Once he got on the steps, he was being blocked by, allies of the big city bosses who really had control of the podium. But Pepper was a scrappy guy. He kept working his way up. He had some of these railroad workers around him. He got closer and closer to the actual podium itself, going up those steps. And the Democratic chairman and mayor of Pittsburgh, who was a very powerful boss, was yelling, shut it down, stop the convention. The guy who was the chairman of the convention, who was at the podium at the time, said, I can't. The crowd they'll overrun us. These people want Henry Wallace. And Pepper was getting closer and closer. And the guy from Pittsburgh, the boss from Pittsburgh, literally said, this is it. You shut it down now. And he just, went to the mat. And the chairman took his gavel and said, I hear a motion to adjourn. And he banged the gavel, and the crowd booed at loud. They said that the hall shook with the boos and the chants of no. But the chairman said, I hear a majority in favor of adjournment, gavels again, and that night was closed down. And frankly, overnight, they changed the ticketing for the convention. It is said that there were more jobs offered and bribes and more backroom deals than perhaps at any convention in history. When they convened the next day, Henry Wallace, in the initial vote for vice president, won the largest number of votes, but not a majority. And as the wrangling went on, slowly but surely delegations switched, and Harry Truman was nominated, and Wallace was sent back on the train with his bag.
So for all the Bernie bros who think the DNC was screwing things up last nomination and this time, this is real power politics by the party. I mean, this is party bosses really overriding the will of the people. We're talking with John Nichols. His book is The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, The Enduring Legacy of Henry Wallace's Anti-Fascist, Anti-Racist Politics. We've got about another 10, 12 minutes or so. As you mentioned, FDR wants to keep Henry part of the team. He says you can have any job you want in the cabinet. Why does he take commerce? Is it just to get back at Jesse Jones?
Well, we won't go too deep into that because Jesse Jones is a guy he was fighting with for years in the administration on whether you'd have a pro-worker approach to the defense industries and what came after or not. And so no, I don't think it was just to get back at Jesse Jones, but it did push him aside. It pushed aside, and that's the best evidence that Roosevelt really wanted Wallace there. because Roosevelt had to push aside other people to put Wallace in that position. We don't think of the Secretary of Commerce today in the way that it was thought of then. In today, Secretary of Commerce is sort of like a basically, at least in the Trump administration, extension of Trump and Wall Street, right? At best. In those days, commerce really was thought of how you organize work and our industries, and it's where you planned for the future. And Wallace had written a book called 60 Million Jobs. His argument was that coming out of World War II, the United States needed to create 60 million new jobs. And it needed to do so because we would not just convert the defense industries back to peacetime industries, but you had to put these veterans who were coming home to work. You had to make sure that women who had come into the workforce were, they could continue to work if they chose. And at the deepest level, basically, that you just had to make sure that we didn't fall back into a Great Depression. And so he had this very energetic vision, and commerce was where both Roosevelt and Wallace thought that they could carry it forward.
So FDR dies 6 weeks after the inauguration. Truman becomes president. You write of Truman that he may have been a man of many good intentions, but he set the stage for the devolution of the Democratic Party. Yeah. How did he show those good intentions, and how did he start things going south?
Yeah, my book is not an anti-Truman book. I have some people who will say, "Oh,
Jonathan Chait thinks it's an anti."
Oh, yeah, it definitely does, and others do. That's true. Yeah. But the truth of the matter is, if you read the book, you'll find that I say some nice things about Truman, and the problem for Truman was he was a man of the party as it existed. He wanted to keep his coalition together. So Truman did some great things. Remember, he integrated the military. And frankly, in his 1948 campaign, there was, and I think this is in response to some extent to the campaign that Wallace ran in 48, while a very unsuccessful campaign for the presidency, it did push Truman on a number of issues. And Truman did do some good things. He also raised the minimum wage. He entertained the idea of doing a national health care plan. So let's understand that. But at the same time, Truman was cautious, and particularly when he took over the presidency after Roosevelt, 1945 into in that period into early 1946, he did not hit the ground running domestically in a way that really sort of seized the moment. And this is where things really started to fall apart, because you needed to come out of World War II with a New Deal vision. You had to keep going big, not fall back. And my fear, or my argument in the book, is that Truman pulled too many punches in that 46-47 period. And as a result, obviously, Republicans took charge of Congress, or at least got the dominant hand there with the segregationists in the South. And you ended up in a situation where they passed the Taft-Hartley law. They did a lot of other initiatives that really began to undo the New Deal. The other thing that Truman did was get rid of most of the New Dealers. I mean, that's the amazing thing, is that he inherited a cabinet that still had many of the people who had started with Roosevelt back in March of 1933, people like Henry Wallace and Francis Perkins and others. And within a little over a year, they were gone. They were all gone, to the point where the conservative newspapers at the time were literally saying, we won, that they have a Democratic president, but the New Deal is finished. And that was
What about Wallace as president, 1945 to 1948 or 49? He would later write that he had been a little too naive about Soviet Union instincts and Soviet Union policies. Is it possible that as president in that immediate post-war period, he might have done things as president that he would later think, "Ooh, I may have been too friendly with Uncle Joe Stalin"?
Yeah, I think so. And you're generous. You say that he wrote he was a little bit naive. I think he wrote he was pretty naive. And I think that's important to understand. This was, of course, the great wrestling. Wilkie and Wallace, and I think extending from Roosevelt, believed that you could work with the Soviet Union, and that ultimately you could create some sort of post-war cooperation that while skeptical and even critical, would be short of a Cold War. There's no question Wallace didn't want a Cold War. Now, if we don't know how wrong or right he was about that, because he never implemented, but there's certainly good reason to believe that that Wallace might have changed his approach relatively quickly. You just don't know once you inherit the presidency. My sense is what Wallace wanted to do. There are two things that he really wanted to do. Number one, he wanted to have a post-war vision that was anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, and that set the United States up as an example to the rest of the world. Whether that would have brought him, how quickly that would have brought him into clash with other forces in the world is an open question. But I suspect it would have brought him into clash pretty quickly. And the other thing, though, was a domestic component of that. He really wanted to avoid a Red Scare. He didn't want to have what became McCarthyism. And in both of those cases, he fought very, very hard on those fronts. And there are people who tell you that Wallace would have been the perfect president, right? Post-war, he would have done everything right. There are other people who said he would have been an absolute scorching disaster, right? You hear both sides of that debate. What I argue in my book is that in 1943, 1944, Wallace held out a vision for the post-war era that is, especially on the domestic front, incredibly sound and really valid. And as regards foreign policy, his vision was quite close to that of Roosevelt. In fact, he was echoing Roosevelt on a lot of fronts. And we don't know exactly where it would have played out had he become president. There's also people who debate whether he would have dropped the atomic bomb and a host of other issues. But what we do know is that from a domestic standpoint, I don't think there's any question that he would have sought to address racism and segregation at a much earlier point. And that is something we ought not lose sight of when we talk about, the choices that political parties make at particular points in history.
We've got about 4 minutes left. I want to focus on that period, 1947-48. He gives a speech in 46 that finally gets him fired. Yep. And then he runs he gears up a campaign, as I said, as the Progressive Party candidate for president as an independent. The CIO says it's a bad idea. Eleanor Roosevelt writes one of her columns saying he will accomplish nothing and merely destroy the very things he wishes to achieve. Why did he answer a call that nobody else heard and run as an independent instead of challenging Truman in the primary, pushing him to the left the same way that Bernie Sanders has pushed Joe Biden to the left?
You get to one of the key elements of my book. And I make no bones about arguing that those who wanted him to challenge within the party were wise. And these were a lot of prominent folks like Claude Pepper and the former Attorney General of California and other folks who formed a group called Democrats for Wallace. And they battled for that. Wallace looked at the reality that I think he was embittered to some extent by the 44 convention and by the power of the status quo forces within the party. And he chose to go out. He chose to mount this independent campaign. His initial poll numbers and crowds were reasonably good, and I think that's often what happens with third-party candidates. Remember, we come from Wisconsin, and so we have our Robert La Follette history. But the 48 campaign crashed and burned. It ended up minusculely a minuscule portion of what had been hoped for. And while it probably pushed Truman on a number of issues to the left, it did not ultimately leave much of a legacy. You can find some elements. I write a lot about what did linger on and sort of connections to the future. It's interesting that one of his supporters in 48 was a guy named George McGovern, and there's a lot of other people who were supporters like Franklin Wright and Albert Einstein, quite a young Brady Friedan, quite a list of people. Obviously W.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson. So there are elements of that 48 campaign that are very romantic and that you can point to and see strength in it. But ultimately, Wallace accepted the support of the Communist Party. He accepted the support of some other folks trying to build a Popular Front coalition that just never succeeded.
What do you take as the message from the fact that Strom Thurmond, running as a segregationist Dixiecrat, carried 4 whole states while Henry Wallace only carried 30 precincts? What does that tell us about the country at that time?
Oh, it tells us a lot. Remember, Wallace and Thurmond got about the same actual number of votes, but Thurmond's were very concentrated in one place. Wallace's were concentrated too. They were mostly in New York and California, a handful of other places. But what it tells me is this, because we have so little time, it's just that at that time, segregationism was still a very powerful force in this country. And it's interesting that after the 1948 campaign, the supporters of Strom Thurmond were quickly welcomed back into the Democratic Party, whereas the supporters of Henry Wallace were shuttered out. And yes.
Not only were they welcomed back in, but someone who supported Strom Thurmond became Adlai Stevenson's vice presidential nominee in 1952. And one of the points you make, and I'm afraid it's where we're going to have to leave it, is that Republicans have done such a much better job revering their failed crusaders like Barry Goldwater than the Democrats have done honoring theirs like George McGovern. And yes. Republicans treat Barry Goldwater like John the Baptist, and they treat George McGovern like a leper. And the implications for what the Democratic Party became in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and what it's going to become in the future is a very important part of your book, which unfortunately we do not have time to continue talking about today. And that is why people should get John Nichols' new book, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, The Enduring Legacy of Henry Wallace's Anti-Fascist, Anti-Racist Politics. It is from the fine folks at Verso Press. John, thank you very much for being with us today.
Stuart, it's just an honor. Thanks so much.
We have 3 Madison book events to tell you about this week, all involving Madison authors. Tonight at 7, our friends at the Wisconsin Book Festival presenting Emily Temple to talk about her new book, The Lateness, with Madison's own Chloe Benjamin. If you care about adolescent girls, this is a book and conversation you will enjoy. More information at wisconsinbookfestival.org. If you want political novels with thoughts that touch on race, economic justice, and our increasingly fragile democracy, our friends at Mystery to Me Books are presenting Stephen Wright, a clinical associate professor at the UW-Madison Law School, to discuss his new novel, The Coyotes of Carthage. More information at mysterytomebooks.com. And for our younger readers, Storytime Live with Madison author Stuart Stotts discussing and reading from his new book, Father Grappi, Marching for Civil Rights. That is from the Storybook Live, the Badger Biographies list from our friends at the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. That happens Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. on their Facebook page. Those other 2 events were at 7 o'clock tonight and on Thursday. That is all the time we've got today. On behalf of engineer Liz Stottleman, News and Public Affairs Director Shali Pittman, and all of us here at Madison BookBeat, I'm Stu Levitan. Thank you for listening. Now, join us now as Ben Sidran plays us out with a bit of Little Sherry. Please stay tuned for Alex Wilding White and All Around Jazz. You are listening to WORT 89.9 FM Madison, listener-sponsored community radio. Thank you.
This is the Insurgent Radio Kiosk for Monday, June 22nd.